I think, Franz, there's one confusion here, which I think I'd like to uh, get rid of in a way. See, in the early days of quantum mechanics, people worried about the collapse of the wave function, but not thinking of it as a physical process. I mean, many people, including most particularly Wigner, I think, because I talked to him quite a lot when I was in Princeton. I had conversations with Wigner, which were very interesting. And he had the view, as many others did, that somehow the collapse of the wave function was an effect of consciousness. That is to say, the terminology in quantum theory is very much suggestive of that, because it says you make an observation, and this observation induces the collapse of the wave function. Now that you see, it's rather suggesting that the collapse doesn't take place unless a conscious being comes along and looks at it. Then that measurement that the conscious being makes by looking at it, if you like, collapses the wave function. So it's as though it's the consciousness which causes the collapse of the wave function. That's very different from my view. It's almost the opposite of mine. In my view, is saying, no, no, no. It's not that consciousness causes the collapse. The collapse would take place quite independently of whether they're conscious beings or not. I like to think of a particular example. I mean, just a sort of thought experiment, if you like. I imagine that there's a very distant planet somewhere which has very, very much like the Earth. It just happens that no life, no conscious beings ever came about on that planet. But it's otherwise like the Earth. Now, the weather on the Earth is supposed to be very delicately dependent upon very small effects. So people talk about the butterfly effect. If the butterfly's wing flaps one way, then the weather goes one way. And if it flapped a different way, then the weather might have a completely different effect. So it's a thing which means that the behavior of the system depends very, very delicately on the initial state. Okay, now this planet that I'm imagining has no life on it, no butterflies. Nevertheless, you have weather on this planet. But since there is no conscious being or no beings which collapse the wave function, according to that view, collapse of the wave function doesn't take place. Therefore, you have weather, which is a superposition of all different weathers. And you have a space probe which goes to this planet and takes a photograph of the weather on the planet. Now, that weather, there's no being, no conscious being on the space probe. It just takes a photograph. Now, as it returns to the Earth, it transmits this photograph, which is now of a superposition of different weathers. And somebody on a screen looks at the signal on the Earth, and as soon as that human being looks at the picture on the screen, suddenly collapse. The wave function happens, because only then does the conscious being become part of the system, and then the weather becomes one weather. To me, this is completely ridiculous. The weather is going to be one weather, whether there's a being on it or not. It's not because of living beings on the planet. It's not because of consciousness on the planet. It's because the collapse of a wave function is a physical process which takes place when things become large enough, superpositions become large enough, in a way which I could be very explicit about if necessary, what I mean by large enough, and it would collapse the wave function quite independently of conscious beings.